Welcome to Listening First, the podcast on rehabilitation and recovery, where through authentic, open conversations and space for sharing knowledge, we explore all things recovery and rehabilitation, discovering new meaning and fresh perspectives along the way. I'm Patrick Boyd.
And I'm Ben Marram. And in each episode, we're joined by a special guest to delve into topics designed to inspire, enlighten, and spark meaningful conversations in real life. Listening First is for anyone with an interest in recovery and rehabilitation, whether you come from a professional background, have lived experience, or are simply curious about the field. We approach every conversation with openness and curiosity, never assuming we have all the answers, and always making space for new perspectives.
Today, we're joined by Vicki Gilman, an internationally respected leader in neuro rehabilitation and complex case management. Vicki is currently the Executive Chair at Social Return Case Management, where she leads the service's overall strategic direction, development and delivery. Her clinical roots are in neurophysiotherapy, and Vicki has dedicated a career to helping people with acquired neurological conditions through both direct clinical work and leadership of specialist services. She qualified as a physiotherapist in 1988 at King's College, London, then completed an MSc in neurorehabilitation at Brunel University.
With over 3 decades in the field, Vicki blends hands-on clinical understanding, academic insight, leadership, research and advocacy. Her work emphasises holistic biopsychosocial approaches, co-production and innovation in supporting people with very, very complex needs.
We're very fortunate to have her with us today to hear her perspectives on complexity in rehabilitation, leadership in case management, and how research and practice can blend to deliver better outcomes.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for inviting me to this podcast. I think it's a wonderful idea and a great platform. And thank you for that glowing introduction.
Well, thank you for joining us. We were really interested in having you on the podcast to speak to us, given the breadth of experience and knowledge that you have around case management, around clinical practice and rehabilitation in general. So we mentioned there that you were a physiotherapist. Can you just give us a little flavour of how you ended up working within this field in private rehabilitation?
Yeah, I can. It's all been by accident, really. And I'm still a physiotherapist in terms of my registration, although I don't do hands-on and I haven't for many years. But I started in the NHS and military hospital and did sort of a more traditional path, I suppose you'd say. And then I just moved for personal reasons to a new area of the country in the northeast. And I couldn't find anything in my area of specialism, but I did get offered some private work. And I was already an expert witness for the courts at that stage, but I was doing NHS work alongside that. And I wasn't that keen on the idea of private work. I was typically the sort of person that said, absolutely not. I think it's a wrong thing. The NHS does it all. We complete people's rehabilitation journeys. Thank you very much. But I took it on, and I took it on the basis of the idea that there were 3 particular clients. I think 2 had had brain injuries and 1 had had a stroke. Similar time period. So I took it on the basis of a short period of time, agreed goals. If you haven't improved by the end of it, then I will need to stop. And I did that because all 3 were talking about going to a high street MSK physiotherapy practice if I wouldn't take them on. And I knew more about what their needs might be. And I thought, as a second opinion, if you like, it might help them move on if they tried it and it didn't work. And of course, with some really tight goals and a tight time frame and 3 very motivated people, they all improved and I learned something. And I learned that what I had thought was the whole of rehabilitation in my NHS and military jobs wasn't necessarily. And I learned that you could provide very ethically some fantastic input in the independent sector. And yeah, it changed my mind about some things. It made me wonder why I had that view. Where had that come from? I think it had come from working in those systems and hearing everyone around me saying, you've achieved your potential, that's it now, there isn't any more, and not following people up because I wasn't in systems and services that did that. And so I believed in what we all said until I realised it wasn't so. And that started a path. And from there, it just grew and grew in various different ways. And I've worked in different places. I've led different things. I founded and set up more than one rehabilitation service, generally working as multidisciplinary teams because I belong in MDTs and I like working across allied healthcare professions and with allied healthcare professions, and now, in fact, teaching across them as well. So that was really how it started. It's all been by accident. Do sometimes get asked if I had a grand plan at the beginning. I most certainly didn't. I still don't. I suppose I just like to change people's lives and support other people to learn some of what maybe I've been fortunate enough to learn and share that. That way, hopefully more of us are giving more opportunity to people to really explore what rehabilitation can mean.
Yeah, I'm always struck by. I almost refer to it as an origin story, like a Marvel superhero. That everyone's got an origin story in rehabilitation. Those kind of first early experiences of either a piece of work or a client or some work that they did that kind of set, the process off. And I think just hearing you talk with real warmth about that experience and kind of challenging some of those assumptions is really interesting to hear.
Yeah, I spoke at a conference recently and I managed to find a photo of me treating somebody many, many years ago when I was in the classic physio uniform and I held the belief that, once we said you were done, you were done. Actually, it's a hypothesis. And so we're only ever guessing, an educated guess, hopefully, yes. But we need to measure outcomes. We need to keep being curious, thinking about what might come next, responding to what people's priorities, motivations are. And then often there is more. Depends how you define rehabilitation, which is a bit of a current interest of mine. It depends how far you would say rehabilitation goes.
That's one of the things that Ben and I wanted to touch on today with you is ultimately what is rehabilitation, because I suppose the meaning of rehabilitation changes depending on the person and their circumstances. How would you describe rehabilitation, Vicki?
I can't do it in a nutshell. I'm not sure anyone can. And I've been thinking about this a lot recently and also reading some of the papers around this, and particularly struck by Professor Derek Wade on his rehabilitationmatters.com site, which I recommend for people interested in this topic, where he kind of challenges us really, because he says the phrase "I think rehabilitation is" can be surprisingly difficult to complete. And I think it is. There are lots of different definitions. Some of them are about services and what they offer, processes. Some of them are about the experience the person has. Some of them are about the kinds of outcomes that we're looking at. And I think, notably in certain things that I've read, including, interestingly, if you're somebody that works within the medical legal world, the Rehabilitation Code and the Pre-Action Protocol for Personal Injury Claims, they don't define rehabilitation. There's this sort of, I think, tacit understanding that we all know what it means, but I'm not sure we do. And most recent work that I've done clinically as a case manager, that really takes rehabilitation, can take rehabilitation a long way into just melding it with life and lifestyle. I'm a great believer in rehab being with people who have complex issues, particularly being a 24-hour process. So I'm always fond of saying, look, if you take physio, for example, but this applies to any of our colleagues, I think, it's not the hour the physio's in the room or the cubicle where something magical happens. And then nothing magical happens toward recovery and rehabilitation until the next time you're in that room with that person. Actually, I think rehabilitation is much more about those other 23 hours in the day. What we as professionals are hopefully doing is understanding the person, being able to understand what they want, what kind of meaning they need to have from their rehab. That probably comes first for me, I think. Being able to assess where the issues are that are stopping that happening, and then formulating approaches, working together, but also working with the person themselves, working with families, working with professional carers, support workers, and ensuring that we are driving forward altogether, something that is moving somebody forward and developing them. And because the kind of work that I've always done is with people who have very long-term conditions and very long-term potential for their rehabilitation or for change and development, it kind of makes sense to me that it melds with life and with, we all change, right? We all have more chapters in our lives. I'm very different to how I was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, maybe even a week ago. Hopefully I'm continuing to develop as a person, as a professional, all those different aspects of my life. And so are our clients. And so I'm not sure. I think that's one of the difficulties in defining it is, where does rehabilitation stop and life begin? You don't really want there to be a join. Hopefully they're all a continuum.
Yeah, I mean, it got me thinking there. You were talking about even that word outcome, and what does outcome mean in that context if it's constantly changing, or when does someone ever become rehabilitated, with that kind of the finality of it, and how do you describe that process to someone? Can you describe that process to someone? And I think often in my work you kind of hear about people describing, and maybe more so when I worked in sort of statutory care, about active versus inactive therapy. And is it ever inactive? What does inactive mean? And you got me thinking there about that 24-hour approach. And can we ever really say it's an inactive process?
No, and maintenance therapy, that was quite big when I trained, I remember, and in the early years of what I did. And I thought of it as a very passive, inactive process, but gradually came to see it as something that requires an active process behind it to achieve it, and also can really be an aim in itself. Particularly, I have one gentleman in mind that I had some involvement with over a number of years, and he was statutorily funded by the CQC, CHC funding at the time. And we kept making an argument for active therapy. It was a physical issue in particular that he had. He would contract up again if we didn't continue to ensure. It was quite a complex level of need and support to those who were moving him to ensure that he did stay in a good situation without a lot of pain and difficulty. And they would pull the funding every time we achieved it. And so he would have to get worse in order to then need it again. And he always sticks in my mind as someone who, I think I kind of learned it by then, but he's a great example of why it's an active thing. It's not passive. Maintaining somebody might be a very, very important goal and require quite a lot of input to do that. And I think all three of us have seen that kind of thing. But that brings about the need to educate people as to what rehabilitation is then. And if it's hard for us to define it and see where the edges are, then it's very hard to educate people in simple ways. It's one of those things that's hard to nutshell, I think.
I agree. From what you were saying there, Vicky, it kind of highlights that there are so many different facets to rehabilitation and so many different things to think about, rather than trying to find a definition of rehabilitation. Instead, we need to think about the various aspects of rehabilitation, the components that are required to help somebody to achieve what rehabilitation should be for them.
Yes, I think one of my feelings that I've had for a long time, but it grows ever stronger, is I think we need very honest conversations with people as well about when you are in receipt of rehabilitation from a service that does have edges itself. So, for example, it might be that it covers a geography, so you have to live in that geography. It might be that it covers an age group, a diagnostic category. If it is a statutorily provided service, then it is almost certainly the case that it needs to offer you a certain amount and be fair to the population it serves. And so there will be an end point, but it doesn't mean that it's the end point of your rehabilitation necessarily. I do think we're having better conversations than we did 10 and certainly 20 years ago, but I still think that we box it in. So one of the examples I often use, this is way too simplistic, I'm obviously aware of this. Supposing that the UK as a whole, across everybody with, I don't know, let's pick brain injury or stroke, something like that, could offer those who had a long-term issue with it 50% of what they might need in total. Not that you can tell, because this is too simplistic, but if we can never offer everything, then after a while, and I think this is kind of what has happened and why earlier in my career I formed those views, everybody working in it, everybody experiencing it would think that was 100% because it would be all that ever happened. And I talk about this a little when I talk about my work as a case manager, where sometimes, not always, we might have the wherewithal for that person to explore anything and everything for the rest of their life that might make a difference. And so some of that has taught me that rehabilitation can be an incredibly long, broad, deep thing for an individual. And I think that keeps alive the art of the possible. It keeps alive in my mind and other people's, and it gives an example of what might truly be possible if some of the barriers that are there in other services and in other ways are not there. But that doesn't mean that there's not great stuff going on in services that do have edges to them in terms of geography, diagnosis, time frame. There's amazing work that goes on. I'm incredibly proud of our country and the NHS and the rehabilitation services we still have. I recognise it's harder. It's harder than when I worked in it as well. It's really challenging. And we keep doing more and better with less, I think. But it isn't right to say that it's all of it. And I think we have to be very, very careful and wary of conversations around rehabilitation potential if they feel like they are shutting off the potential for further recovery and thought processes around that.
Yeah. I think one of the challenges is it's that expectation is an interesting word, and I think hope is often discussed in rehabilitation, and I think those dilemmas between, you can hear it, implicitly people worrying about unrealistic hope, that unrealistic thing, and how do you navigate that, Vicky, in your work, or how have you navigated that in your work, or what have you learned about sort of hope and outcomes and goals in your time?
It distresses me still to say that I think as a young physiotherapist, and again, I think it's because it's what I'd learned, I was concerned about building false hope and that we needed to err on the side of a lot of caution. So we didn't do that. And I think I didn't allow people to hope or to have conversations with me about the entirety of their hope early on in my career. I wasn't alone in that. I think that was somewhat part of the services I was working in. And this is not pointing fingers at services or people. It's just kind of how it was expressed at the time. I'd like to think we've moved forward somewhat. I think we've got further to go. I think hope is foundational. I think it's unbelievably important. I think it adds energy and meaning at really difficult times. My experience is that you don't reduce people's hope by telling them that, that you don't think they should hope for that, for example. And I still see that happening. So I advocate for hope these days and support that hope. I don't mean to say hope for something that I do remember having a client once upon a time whose only rehab goal was, I want to be a professional footballer. I think it was unlikely prior to the injury, and it was certainly much, much more unlikely afterward. But that was just a really powerful, important thing for this person. And we didn't want to not put it in the assessment. So we did state it with an exclamation mark. And that's always struck me too as a story of, he knew that was a sort of unrealistic hope, but it was his way of expressing things about him that were important. And I think family also need hope. I went to a superb conference earlier this year in Oxford, and the theme for the whole day was hope. And there were a large number of family members and people who had experienced brain injury, but it was mostly about family members and their hope. And it was humbling to listen to. And it redoubled my thoughts that it is foundational. It is really, really important. And we have to give it room and hear it and understand it and not try and shut it down, because I think it does bring energy and drive and direction and many other important things. And I know it's something that's close to your heart as well, Ben, and you would probably talk about it in some other ways, I suspect, from a psychological point of view. I think it's important.
Yeah, I mean, I think just as a very human thing, like on a human level, we're aspirational, right? We all have hopes and goals, even if we're aware of that they might be not necessarily unrealistic, but it's important to us. It's probably a strange segue, but I promise it's relevant. But Patrick and I were talking about coffee, weirdly enough, before we started meeting today. And, I've got a whole ritual and routine and maybe this kind of aspiration of being a budding barista at some point in my life. For someone, if someone would say to me, Ben, just stick to the psychology, stay away from the coffee stuff. It's not about that, is it? It's about connecting and meaning and purpose and everything you've talked about there. And I think hope as a foundation for rehabilitation, it's very difficult to define rehab, but I think that's a good direction that we should all aim for. And certainly, as you were talking there, Vicky, it was making me reflect back on people I've worked with, families I've worked with, where that has been so important. And almost the moments where hope has been dashed for a variety of reasons, not blaming services either, but you can really see the wind being knocked out of them and about, well, how do I make sense of this situation now?
And I think in the independent sector, I have many, many times been challenged around the idea that, it links, I think, in rehabilitation, particularly with neurological conditions, to the idea that in the independent sector, you might be going beyond what health and social care can offer. And there may have been predictions of your potential to rehabilitate, to improve, and you may have got to the point that people thought you were going to get to. And so are we building false hope by offering more? Part of the answer to that is, well, then outcome measure everything. Do that thing that I did right at the beginning when I thought I shouldn't be taking money from people to treat them, but I don't like the idea of them paying money elsewhere for that to somebody who isn't a neuro specialist. So what I'll do is keep the time frame, make it very tight. What is it they want to achieve? And then we'll measure it and we'll have that conversation at the beginning about whether we continue. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. I think I think we can be more open with people. So I think we can be open with people about their hope and hear it and hold it with them, for them sometimes. I think we don't have to give a massive response to it. I don't find that's what people are looking for, but I do think that's how I was wired to begin with. Was if somebody says, I hope I'm going to walk, I am going to walk, you had to get them to understand that that wasn't going to happen if you thought that was very, very unlikely. And it came from a place of thinking we were doing a good thing. I think we were probably doing the reverse. So I think we hold it, we work with it, but also we have those honest conversations about, well, okay, you want to be that professional footballer, get that, okay. I don't think we ever actually said, you do know that's not going to happen. There was kind of a bit of amusement in it from the client as well, but it was like, well, so let's break that down, shall we? What are the first steps we need to take? Football's obviously really important in your life. And as well as the physical side of that, you know, would you like to be involved in? Do you support anyone? Where can we go? How can we do that? And making something around that helpful to progress in meaningful ways. And in that way, you are nurturing that hope in a sense. You're not. I don't think we can give it or take it away. Actually, I think that's a daft idea, probably. Um, so I'm very critical of my earlier self in many ways, but I think I was just very similar to many, many other people who qualified when I did. And I guess we've all moved forward and learned and changed. And what teaches you the most is those people, in my case, usually brain injured people that I've worked with. They and their families, more than any course, any amazing network of people such as yourselves. And I learn all the time from them, but I've learned the most from the people that I've worked with.
one of my observations is that with hope, if we're going to be encouraging people to hope and harnessing that as part of the rehabilitation, we also have to promote that our clients need to have choice and control over every aspect of their rehabilitation. And when it comes to their choices and them having control, sometimes they may prioritize things that as therapists and case managers, we don't actually see as being the priority. But, it's their life and it's their rehabilitation. So they're the ones who should be making these decisions. So I think that choice and control kind of underpins hope, because they're the ones who can make decisions to achieve what they want to achieve.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point, and I think they are often very linked. I guess one of the thoughts from working in early stages a long time ago now, but doing some early stage work, but also that really forcibly came back earlier this year in Oxford at the conference I mentioned, was that in the earlier stages, when perhaps autonomy and decision making is very difficult to come by, and you kind of need to hand quite a lot of that over to the medical team, hope is the one thing. That's what I was hearing. Hope is the one thing that people feel they've got at that point, maybe. But then as you go further into that journey, then I hate the journey word, but anyway, the journey, just because it gets a bit overused, as you go further down the pathway of change and figuring out what this means in your life, then choice and control, autonomy is really important. And I would also say with that comes in what we often are working with, of balancing autonomy and protection, that empowerment protection kind of seesaw you sometimes feel, particularly as case managers, that we are on. And again, I think in the UK, I'm very proud of us as a country. If you look in other countries, even some quite developed countries, the laws they have behind some of these things are not the same as ours. And we aim to support you to have an independent life and to make choices, including your unwise ones, if you are able to do that. And we will work with you and we will support you and we will help you move your life in the directions you want to. We won't shroud you in cotton wool and reduce your choices. And I think we do really good work around that in the UK. So I'm quite proud to work in a country that allows for that, actually, including I was giving an example at something I was speaking about recently about a gentleman that somebody on my case management team worked with who had a long-standing alcohol problem. And we worked with him. He went through periods of time where he really deeply wished to deal with that. He'd had a brain injury as well. The alcohol problem started prior to the brain injury. And it's the usual thing of finding somewhere that would offer him something for his alcohol issue, given that he had a brain injury. It was very difficult to find, but my colleague did very well. And I think 3 times he managed to tackle that and have some significant periods of really positive living, lovely family life, got a property, a dog, all sorts of things, but still struggled and went back into using more alcohol and having a problem again. And then eventually he decided he didn't want to fight that any longer, that addiction. And so we supported him because that was his capacitous decision. And it was about supporting him to write his will, to get his affairs in order. He lived, I think, for about 18 months after that decision was made, agreeing reasonable levels of drinking in order that his family member, who was a carer, could reasonably look after him. But that's autonomy about the end of your life as well. Choice and control was his. We supported him every step of the way with every different part of that. Now, is that rehabilitation? You'd probably say not, I guess, but it is life. And in there were pieces of rehabilitation where he came back up again and was doing lots more, and we were finding more outlets and things that would develop his skills further. And obviously we were hopeful all the way that would lead to something that might mean he he could resist that difficult problem that he had.
Yeah, so it's a really, I think that example in itself, it's part of the challenge and the pleasure of doing this work, I guess, is about empowering people, choice and control, about thinking through those things. I guess my next question, it sort of came to me. I've had the privilege of being part of your MDT before, Vicki, but how do you, I can imagine the concerns that emerged when you were working with an MDT with that client. How do you, as a case manager, as a leader, how do you ensure, that people stay consistent with the values of, I guess, the theme we're talking about, which is about what rehabilitation is: empowerment, choice, control, hope? What do you think the ingredients are for sort of nurturing an MDT?
That's a really good question. And I guess I've been on both sides of the coin as well, because I've run organizations that provide individuals into MDTs, or indeed the whole MDT, as well as leading on the case management side, where you're needing to lead that MDT that might not be yours as such, or influence an MDT. So I think first and foremost, it's communication for me every time. And probably throughout my rehab journey, that's been the most important thing, not my hands-on skills, but actually my communication abilities. And I think in the sort of scenario we were just talking about, you need to know your MDT, and you need to kind of take the temperature quite regularly with something like that, because we end up often, particularly in case management, where we are following somebody through possibly for the rest of their life. Certainly, I don't ever advocate for case managing if somebody can self-manage. I think that the natural end of case management is teaching someone to self-manage. But for some of our clients, that's not the case, and it won't be. So it might be for a very long time, and also that MDT may have worked with somebody for a very long time. Relationships have been built. Therapeutic relationships incredibly important to the success of what we're trying to do. So it's then very challenging if you have somebody that, those are not the only unwise decisions, the end of life one. There are many, many scenarios. They're the ones we all talk about when we get together, usually as case managers. The really tricky decisions where you are balancing the empower, protect thing, they are really hard for the team as well, I think. Because to see somebody doing something that maybe undoes your good work, that's sometimes a thought. More importantly, that you feel is working so against they have that they've expressed with you so many times, that is maybe harming them in certain ways. I think that's really hard. So you've got to hold that space for the team. You've got to try and understand where people are with that and respect that and support them. But at the same time, I think you are trying to lead that team to ensure that you are honouring what that person wants. So you've got to ensure that you're keeping curiosity at the forefront. That, to me, is one of the biggest tools in the toolkit throughout rehabilitation, but especially as a case manager. You're keeping alive those goals and any changes to them. So the gentleman I was talking about, when he changed to, actually, I think this is what I want, and I'm very happy and settled with my view. This was over a period of time, lots of conversation, to then ensure that we spend time with the team, helping them to understand so that everyone can get on the same page, and to allow honesty about, I'm really struggling with this. And that's difficult, isn't it? Time is short, time costs money. We're all busy, depending on what services you're working within. Is there time to do that? But I think it's really important. Things can fail or work based on that, more than we focus a lot on the technical skills. You've got an MDT and the OT's doing this, the physio's doing that. We've got those ideas of the Venn diagram and there's crossover, but right in the middle of that Venn diagram is communication. And that needs to be, if the circles represented time in terms of their size, then my circle in the middle would be quite big. We need that time, not necessarily with the client, but with each other. And that's how you lead a team successfully through those difficulties. Giving time, communicating well, two-way communicating, hearing where they are with it, and helping people through those difficulties and respecting them, rather than not expecting that they will have them. I think it's almost inevitable in our world that we all struggle at times with some of that.
From what you've said there, Vicky, communication is an absolute cornerstone of what we do in case management and in MDT working. But what goes hand in hand with that is trust. You can't have the communication and the honest conversations and sharing how you genuinely feel about something without actually trusting the people that you're working with. And from my perspective, it's professional to professional trust, but it's also, more importantly, about the client and the family trusting the team of professionals around them and giving them the safe space to explore how they really feel about some of these really challenging topics.
If you can, and that can be difficult. I guess we've all been there too, where it has been difficult to build and maintain that trust. Just sometimes there are factors that make that difficult. But I agree with you, and I think for me, I'd probably put it equal with the trust within the team. The more tricky the issues are that you might be dealing with, the more you need that trust within the team too, I think. But
Absolutely.
it is fundamental, you're right. I always used to, in one of the teams that I ran, so at a team where we were going out to multiple different people rather than a team around one person, I always used to say, we've all got to understand with this complex client group things like their communication needs, things like cognitive issues, behavioral issues, because you could be the best technical person in the world in the thing that you do. But if you're on the doorstep because either you haven't appreciated their need for texting and calling beforehand to support the memory issues to make sure they do remember you're coming, or you haven't built that trust and therapeutic relationship, so they're telling you to get lost probably less politely through the letterbox, then your skills are worth nothing if you're standing on the doorstep. So I think all the things we're circling around here, they relate to me very much back to rehabilitation, to progress, to development in people's lives, and to being able to take the skills that we have into that scenario and help that 24-hour thing actually be really impactful. But these are the skills that are most fundamental and we need first. Otherwise, the rest of it, like I say, you might be on the doorstep, and I have seen that happen.
I guess it's prompted me to think. I mean, the world's changing, Vicky, with technology, with how we do things. COVID had a big impact on how we deliver rehabilitation, how we work as a team. I guess I feel like we're in rooms less with people now, particularly from at a team level. Maybe in your role as an expert, maybe conferences are more online now. How do you think the landscape has changed because of the introduction of technology? But how do you think it will change going forward, or how do you see it progressing?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. It has, hasn't it? And I think COVID probably sped up what was probably coming anyway. I've got to say, I do like the fact that we can do this. We can get an MDT together much more easily online. They are always tricky if you've got a large MDT of busy people, of course. And so, as a case manager, I'm sure Patrick, you'll have the same thing where you're thinking, I can't have everyone on any one single day. So who do I drop? It's quite tricky, particularly when you consider the importance of that communication piece. So I think it's really, really helped. I don't particularly like this bit of technology if I haven't met everyone in the team. I think if you can get everyone together in person in order to form the relationships, it then becomes slightly, I guess, perhaps you notice some of the more nuanced parts of people's communication on the screen if you've been in a room with them and actually absorbed that. I also think if you've got particularly difficult things to talk about, if you've got tricky team dynamics, I'm not particularly keen on doing online meetings for those. I don't think they work very well. And the larger the team, I find myself sort of going round on the screen to look at this. And the same with when I was Babacom chair, we have the council is 16 people. That's quite a large group of people to get to know around the country. So it does mean you can get people, you can give opportunities to somebody who lives in Devon who couldn't come otherwise, or somebody in the north of Scotland. They can be part of it. But I learned a lesson there actually when I was very first chairing, and we were in person, but we had a very long table. And I'm not a lover of those. And a lot of people had sat down before me. And so I was more to one end of the table. And I just didn't pick up on something that was happening at the other end of the table, purely because I was too far away. And I think the same thing can happen on screen. So I'm often kind of going around the screen, do like cameras on. So you can sort of see if you've got a quiet person and they're not coming forward, it's harder to know that you've got to give them space and invite them to speak because they're struggling to get that in there. So it's wonderful in lots of ways, but double-edged. And I think it's a great tool in the toolkit, but you need to pick when you're going to use it and why. And we should know the why behind everything that we do. But also technologically this is interesting with clients, isn't it? And I mean, I was really interested in the pandemic. There was a physio company, can't remember who it was now. Anyway, they did an amazing webinar where they were talking about total hands-off, helping somebody relearn to climb the stairs. And it was a particular client, and it was with a support worker or family member, can't remember which, who they could instruct in order to do it safely. But it blew my mind that could be physiotherapy. But actually, there's a lot, we were forced to explore what could we do, even on things you would think are very hands-on. And so I think it's been helpful in extending what we do as long as we pick carefully and as long as we resist the urge from any sources of payment for rehabilitation therapies, especially, to say, do it that way, it's cheaper. Do it that way because that's the right thing for this, what you're trying to achieve, fine. Just cheapening it all, we will lose a lot if we go down that path. But I think there's a lot more technology coming as well in rehabilitation in particular. I'm aware that there are different apps around. I was talking to somebody about a behavioural app, which is a really interesting way of collecting data and information. I think if we can support those people that are there through the 24-hour period and get better data back, that really helps us guide some of the non-physical parts. In addition, I'm very aware of all the robotics and the gamification of the physical and other types of rehabilitation. The way in which we can have a higher and more consistent dosage where that's important. And it isn't always, because we have very fatigable clients often too. But there is more and more that is coming, and that is helping with measurement as well. And so that's back to, if we know what the goal is, if we know what's important to the person, we have great conversations with them so we're all on the same page, and then we give it our best shot, and then we measure. And that circles right back round to good tangible measurement that we can all see and all have the same language for how somebody is progressing. That really helps people with what used to be called that unrealistic hope, I think. Instead of the idea of sort of, well, they just say I can't do this thing and I'm sure I can, and everybody at war. It's more about taking those steps. What's the next thing we need to do toward the big thing you want? And let's measure it and let's see. And we've got the wherewithal to do a lot of that now. I think that's going to make some really big differences, and also help those of us that do need to advocate for what is really needed and guard against the let's just do this because it's cheaper because we've got machines doing it instead, or AI, or we can meet online. So it's wonderful. We need to be very responsible about how we use it. And that's on us, I think.
Fascinating. And some of the things that you've brought up there, Vicki, about the types of technology that there are, you're right, it's the opportunities for use of technology and innovation within rehabilitation are just growing exponentially, which is fantastic. And they are actually some of the things that we will be covering in other episodes of the series. So people should listen out for those if you're interested in listening about innovation and use of technology in rehabilitation. We're just about out of time, Vicki. So a huge thank you to you for your time and for providing us with your insights and views on rehabilitation. And there's so much more that we could talk to you about. I'm sure we could sit here for hours. So we may invite you back to speak about something else if you're interested in that. So thank you, Vicki.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been fun, and I'd be more than happy to come back. And good luck with the podcast. I think it's a great idea. I shall certainly be listening in.
Thank you, Vicki. And to you, our listeners, thank you for joining us and being part of these important conversations. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please like, follow and share the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us to reach more people and to grow our community. And you can connect with us on LinkedIn at Listening First Podcast for updates, discussions and more.
We'd also love to hear from you. So if you've got any questions, suggestions, topics or guests, or just want to share your thoughts, reach out to us on LinkedIn or email us at listeningfirstpod@gmail.com. That's listeningfirstpod@gmail.com. So thanks for being with us as we keep learning, keep sharing, and most importantly, keep listening first.